Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky appeals to aid organizations to help with burst dam aftermath immediately. Zaporizhzhia city holds nuclear disaster response drills day after dam breach. Plus, Russian Defense Ministry accuses Ukrainians of blowing up the ammonia pipeline in Odessa, calls them saboteurs. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on international aid groups to take immediate action to tackle the aftermath of the destruction of the hydropower dam in Ukraine, saying that any group not on the spot helping was simply incapable. President Zelensky said residents in areas of southern Ukraine occupied by Russian troops are without water, food, or medical aid, and it is impossible to determine how many people in the area might die. Ukraine's Prime Minister is urging the United Nations, the International Red Cross, and other bodies to act immediately to help flooded residents of southern Ukraine receiving no help in areas controlled by Russian-occupied forces. The Russian occupiers, in his words, don't even make an effort to help these people. They've left them to perish, he said in a video posted on Telegram, referring to the aftermath of the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric dam. Ukraine says the deluge will swamp tens of thousands of hectares of agricultural land and turn at least 500,000 hectares deprived of irrigation into deserts. 2,000 people have been evacuated from the Ukrainian-controlled part of the flood zone, and waters have reached the highest level in 17 settlements with a combined population of 16,000 people. Russia imposed a state of emergency in the areas of Kherson province it controls, where many towns and villages lie in exposed lowlands below the dam.
Secretary General Guterres, Honorable Mr. Deputy Secretary General Griffiths, respected heads of United Nations agencies, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Madame Spolarich, distinguished leaders of international humanitarian organizations. Last night, Russian forces destroyed the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. This horrifying act of terror has resulted in a massive ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. Dozens of settlements have been already flooded by water. The Ukrainian government has organized the evacuation from the territory of Kherson Oblast under our control. However, on the left bank, in the temporarily occupied area, people have been abandoned by the Russians. 10 settlements have been flooded there, and hundreds of homes have vanished beneath the water. People who stayed there are forced to leave their homes on their own, while those unable to do so find themselves trapped in the face of this disaster. The Russian occupiers don't even make an effort to help these people. They have left them to perish. International humanitarian organizations, on behalf of the government of Ukraine, I urge you, you must act immediately. We appeal to you to take charge of evacuating people from the territories of Kherson Oblast occupied by Russia. We must save the lives of these people whom the occupiers have condemned to death.
Meanwhile, German authorities are promising to send generators, tents, and camp beds to Ukraine to help those affected by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Workers at the logistics center of Germany's Federal Agency for Technical Relief were busy loading relief goods. Ukrainians abandoned their inundated homes as floodwater crested across a swathe of the south on Wednesday after the destruction of a vast dam on the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Residents waded through flooded streets carrying children on their shoulders, dogs in their arms, and belongings in plastic bags, while rescuers used rubber boats to search areas where the waters reached above head height. Villagers in Russian-controlled Ukraine surveyed the damage to their flooded homes after the massive dam breach on Wednesday. Russian-appointed authorities ordered residents of 3 districts to leave their homes as water surged from the collapsed Kakhovka Dam. The village of Kherson in the Kherson region of Russian-controlled Ukraine was completely submerged. Water had risen to the roofs of some of the dwellings in the village, which is located directly on the banks of the Dnieper River. Residents of Kherson traveled through flooded streets by boat to offer help to people waiting for the flooding to subside. Meanwhile, Ukrainian volunteers and the military sailed through the flooded Kherson streets on the day the dam burst, seeking residents in need of drinking water and other humanitarian help. A 38-year-old volunteer for the non-governmental aid organization and his team came to the Kherson with an inflatable boat to provide aid and evacuate stuck residents. Volunteers handed a 65-year-old man, Serhiy, who was looking on from his balcony, a mobile battery for his phone, while he took the risk to climb out of the window into an air conditioner. Ukrainian soldiers on a motorized boat hand bottles of potable water and 2 warm meals to him, just as they do to the others. The Kakhovka Dam collapse coincides with the looming, long-vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia's invasion, likely the war's next major phase. Staying with the destruction of the dam, thousands of dead fish washed up on the shores of the reservoir after the destruction. The major Soviet-era dam in the Russian-controlled part of southern Ukraine. The Kakhovka Reservoir holds about 18 cubic kilometers of water, a volume roughly equal to the Great Salt Lake in the U.S. city of Utah. Destruction of the dam unleashed floodwaters across the war zone in what both Ukraine and Russia said was an intentional attack by the other's forces. Now, as the water surged through the remains of the dam, its levels downstream raced up by meters, while water in the reservoir dried up in a matter of hours. Villagers rushed to construct a makeshift dam in an attempt to save at least some of the fish and preserve as much water as possible for the community to use. Ecologists fear the region's ecosystem will pay a huge price. And the Zaporizhzhia Emergency Services held nuclear disaster response drills 1 day after the dam breach in Russian-controlled Kakhovka. Emergency services and police trained in measuring radiation levels and evacuating civilians. The emptying reservoir that was held back by the dam supplied water that cools Europe's biggest nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia upstream. The UN nuclear watchdog, IAEA, says the plant should have enough water to cool its reactors for some months from a separate pond. The regional governor confirmed the radiological situation around the nuclear power plant remaining stable. The Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant lies some 50 kilometers south of Zaporizhzhia city. Now, Russia's defense ministry is accusing Ukrainians, whom they call saboteurs, of blowing up a section of the Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline that carries fertilizers from Russia to Ukraine in the Kharkiv region. There was no immediate comment on the allegation from Ukraine. The ministry says Russian service personnel had not been injured, but that there were casualties among the civilian population. Fertilizer still in the pipeline was being drained. According to the ministry, the resumption of operations on this ammonia pipeline was one of Russia's conditions for the recent extension of the Black Sea grain deal with Ukraine. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova is dismayed that it will take 1 to 3 months to repair the damaged Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline. Moscow earlier accused so-called Ukrainian saboteurs of blowing up a section of the pipeline in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. Kiev has blamed Russia for repeatedly shelling it. The ammonia pipeline, the world's longest, may be key to the renewal of the Black Sea grain export deal. Moscow has said it will limit the number of ships allowed to travel to Ukraine's port near Odessa. Under the deal, until the pipeline is restarted, it has been shut since Russia sent troops into Ukraine last February. Now, according to the Red Cross, the breach of the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine will have a catastrophic effect on locating landmines in the affected region. The body is warning that it does not know where the hazards are now that the dam has been breached, whereas it had pegged the locations prior to the incident. Now, the ICRC had spent several months helping mine clearance operations in Ukraine, mapping and marking minefields and providing training and equipment. We now speak to Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, Rory Finnan, who is speaking from Cambridge in the UK. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Nice to be with you again.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has called this consequence of the dam burst ecocide, blaming the Russians for the disaster. And one of the scary dimensions of it, as we are reporting, is the dislodgement of landmines, which is a concern for the ICRC and the Red Cross. If anyone knows anything about landmines, it can be fatal. In many cases, it results in, if not a fatality, loss of a limb and amputations and things of that nature. This is just one of the consequences of this incident that has occurred. What's your impression of how far-reaching this disaster will be for both sides?
This is a catastrophic war crime committed by the Russian Federation and its forces against Ukraine, against Ukrainian territory, against life in Ukraine. It will have lasting impacts on Ukraine's topography, its economy, its demography, and it will have lasting international impacts as well, because we know how central this region is to Ukraine's agricultural production. And we also know how critical these canals that run from the Kakhovka Dam, that are supplied by the Kakhovka Dam, we know how central they are to irrigating the areas of central Ukraine and indeed Crimea. This is an example, once again, of a Russian Federation and its military force that is not only cruel, but also incompetent, and not seeing the lasting implications of what they're doing. They're playing with fire. And I want to call to the attention of your viewers what happened in the early days and months of the full-scale invasion after the 24th of February. And that was that Russian troops surrounded the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. Many of them were digging around in irradiated earth, and many were stricken with radiation sickness. That is, they didn't even seem to understand the place they were in. Their commanders did not instruct them properly as to how to protect themselves. And now we're seeing as well this catastrophic weaponization of this dam against Ukraine and Ukrainian territory and indeed life, as I said before. I mean, you showed those heartbreaking pictures, not only of people fleeing their homes, but living creatures that have died due to this senseless act. So this is going to have longstanding implications for us all. I think it will affect, indeed, the supply of grain in the world market. This has been something that's been extremely sensitive over the last few months, particularly for the supply of grain to Africa and many other places, of course. So it indeed is going to be something we'll be grappling with, but it's part of a larger picture here of the Russian Federation seeking to be as cruel as possible to the civilian population. And at the same time, we see something desperate here. That is, clearly the Russian Federation is fearing this Ukrainian counteroffensive. Retreating forces, as we saw in World War II, for instance, blow up dams, they destroy infrastructure as they retreat. Clearly, that was something of this calculus here, although I don't think they understood the massive implications it would have for their own troops, many of whom, according to reports, had to climb trees, were in desperate positions, many of whom perished due to the flooding. And now they're not attending to the needs of civilians on Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. They're letting them die. And it says something that it's President Zelensky in Kyiv calling on international organizations to come and support these people, while the Kremlin says nothing at all.
It has been deduced that sabotage is a likely reason for the destruction of the dam. President Zelensky said as much. And one of our analysts yesterday expertly also explained that it's likely the cause of mines or explosives placed in specific areas in the dam because of the nature of how big the scale of construction of that particular dam is that will cause that level of destruction. But I saw you were quick to say it is Russia. Then why is the U.S. saying they want to wait for investigations to determine that, and Turkey as well?
The U.S. and Turkey are exceptions. I would say the majority of European countries, particularly those who neighbor Russia and the Baltic states, Poland, for instance, were very quick to see this is part of a larger picture. If we neglect the context, if we neglect the very purpose of this war, and I've had the privilege of being on your program a few times, and we've talked about this objective of the Russian Federation vis-a-vis Ukraine, and that is to destroy Ukraine as a state as we know it. It's to eliminate the Ukrainian nation as we know it. We have many Russian politicians professing the view that Ukraine really doesn't exist, that the Ukrainian nation really doesn't exist, and they openly celebrate their attempts to destroy it. We've seen over very many months now deliberate attempts to attack civilians. This is something that we routinely report. We don't necessarily talk about the soldier that's shot the rocket that destroyed the Ukrainian school. We don't talk about the soldiers who shot the artillery shells at Ukrainian hospitals. But we know these are Russian troops doing this. And we've seen over these months not only attacking civilians, but deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. So this is part of a larger piece. Ukraine and the Ukrainian forces did not control this dam at this part. They did not control the facility. And we have many moments on video of Russian troops, number one, explaining that they have mined the dam openly. And we have many of them talking about the need to detonate it, plans to detonate it. And we have President Zelensky last year warning of this and calling on international regulators and observers to come and monitor and surround the dam to protect it. Ukraine gains nothing from this. Ukraine, as you can see, is grieving due to this act, whereas Russian-controlled and Kremlin authorities are listless. They do nothing to support human life and natural life there. So it's very clear who's responsible for this. And in fact, this is part of a larger piece in which Kremlin disinformation just muddies the water. We play both sides and we lose the context. And if we ignore context, it's like reporting on a football game as if there are players in uniforms chasing a ball with no apparent reason. So we know what's going on here. It's clearly the responsibility and an act of the Russian Federation.
How does this affect the counteroffensive being proposed, though the Ukrainians have said it will not affect it? In your view, do you think it will?
Well, naturally, I think this act of wanton destruction, this war crime, is in many respects changing the situation on the ground for any military professional, any general. They're going to have to reevaluate and recalibrate the plans for this counteroffensive. And that's indeed part of the point here. One destroys the dam to complicate the forces that have the momentum that are going on the offensive. This is a typical tactic, as I said earlier, of retreating military force. And we've seen that throughout history. I mentioned briefly World War II, but this is exactly what the Soviets did in retreating during Operation Barbarossa in 1940. So this is going to complicate the counteroffensive. It's not going to stop it, of course, because Ukraine has a clear and abiding objective to retake its territory so that it can protect its people and its civilians and its territory and all the living creatures there. A lot of the moving videos over the past week that my friends have sent me, friends from this part of Ukraine, are of people rescuing dogs, livestock, as well as people. This is a major humanitarian disaster, ecological disaster, but I don't think it's one that's going to stop this counteroffensive, but it was intended to complicate it.
Can you speak more to the point of the false flag allegations against Russia? I brought to our attention the 1999 bombings of the Moscow apartment buildings, allegedly by Chechnya, which led to sentiment growing to support Putin's prime ministership, and he did become prime minister after that incident, incredulous as it may sound, do you, I know you've said as much in your submission, but for people on the outside looking in, it's really incredulous that one will undertake such a venture.
Well, it's incredulous, again, without context. So it's incredulous if we don't look at the Russian state's consistent and historic carelessness with human life. In Russian history and Soviet history, this was repeated over and over again. I was recently looking at Ottoman archival sources that referred to Peter I, sometimes referred in Russia as Peter the Great. And the Ottoman Sultan used to refer to him as Deli Petro, that is mad, crazy Peter, because he threw so many troops into battle. He didn't seem to care how many were lost. This is a consistent military tactic, but it's one that we can see also in Russia itself. And the fact of the matter is there is substantial evidence, most of it circumstantial, but still substantial evidence that that indeed was a deliberate explosion of a residential building by the Kremlin to legitimate, in a wag the dog fashion, this invasion of Chechnya, which then led to the leveling of places like Grozny. Yes. And once again, we in the international community did very little in response to this act of wanton destruction. So this is part of a larger piece here. We see over the course of Soviet and Russian history repeated attempts and repeated actions to invade Russia's neighbors, to reestablish control of territories and places and nations that used to be colonial possessions. So it's very important, once again, for us to remember that Russia itself, the Federation, is an expansionist land empire. It's different from the kind of maritime empires that we know of, the British, the French, the Portuguese, that were maritime, that crossed a sea to get to a colony. Russia operated differently. It expanded and took contiguous territory, and Ukraine is one example of that. Crimea is another example of that. Historically, the land of the Crimean Tatars, a Muslim, Sunni, Turkic-speaking nation that existed into the 18th century and then was effaced from the earth. We see it as well with Circassia, another Muslim nation along the Black Sea that no one remembers very much anymore. We recently had an Olympics in Sochi, on the Black Sea coast in the Russian Federation. Sochi is actually historically Shacha, the Circassian capital that was effaced from the earth, reduced to rubble, and its people subjected to ethnic cleansing and genocide. This is a historical refrain, and so when one puts these things into a broader context, you can see why this false flag operation in Chechnya makes some sense. Obviously, it prompts our moral incredulity, and I agree with you, it's a shocking thing. But it is part of a larger piece with respect to the Kremlin that we need to acknowledge. This is not a political regime that cares about human life. It's not interested in the future. It clings to the past and is seeking to conquer a neighboring country and destroy its people.
With the benefit of such hindsight, looking forward, I'm wondering how the people of Russia themselves take this in, knowing that this is a recurring decimal. Is this a situation where the people follow, as in the case of North Korea, and blindly, as it were, and there's no call for regime change, there's no call for accountability on the part of President Putin because of his stringent putting down of any dissent in Russia?
This is a huge question and a very problematic issue, clearly. Why have Russian citizens been so, on the whole, so passive in response to this wanton act of aggression towards a neighboring country? There are lots of possible answers here. The most important thing to remember is that the Kremlin rules by force and by fear. And there is a lot of fear in Russian society, and it's been there for some time. And it's also a place that has leveraged a rhetoric of grievance. And this is something that the Trump administration in the United States has done very effectively, and it's a very frightening use of political and social power. That is, to use this sense of the past as grievance. We've been victimized We are being replaced in this kind of far-right American political language, and the forces of Trump in the United States became very entrenched because of that popular acceptance of grievance, particularly white grievance. The same thing can be applied here and understood in the context of the Russian Federation today. For a very long time, the Russian Federation and state television sources, voices in the public discourse, have been talking about a West that is at war with Russia. Sitting here in Cambridge, I, for a very, very long time, with many Russian friends, have found that absolutely absurd, because if I go down to London, half of the city is owned by Russian oligarchs. The Russian Federation was given a seat at the United Nations Security Council without any appropriate paperwork. They were just judged rather randomly and casually as the legal successor to the Soviet Union, and they were given that seat at the Security Council with veto power. They were given a seat in the G8. They were given millions of assistance. Yet nonetheless, the story that Putin tells to the Russian people about their history after the fall of the Soviet Union is one of loss and grievance. And what it shows us is that the geopolitical catastrophe that he thought was the fall of the Soviet Union, and you'll recall that's how he spoke about the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. What it reveals to us is what was tragic about it was the loss of empire, not the death of a communist ideology, not a decline of, let's say, leftist political thinking. It instead was the loss of imperial power in the region of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. That is what Putin has mourned and lost, and that's what he's seeking to reclaim.
Finally, Professor, I noticed you mentioned the Olympics in your earlier submission. That reminds me of the 2008, I think, Summer Olympics in Beijing, where there were calls for boycotts of the Olympics in China by Amnesty International and other organizations because of controversy concerning human rights violations on the part of China. Now, people of the ilk of Henry Kissinger mentioned that you should separate sports from politics. As a consequence of this conflict, for instance, Alina Svitolina, the Ukrainian tennis player, refused to shake the hand of Ariana Sabalenka, after their tennis match. And Sabalenka, on her part, said she does not support the war in Ukraine and does not support her own president. She went as far as to say that, and went as far as to say she was suffering from mental health challenges because of the estrangement of the international community and other tennis players because of Belarus's and Russia's position in this war. Is it fair to hold the people of Russia and athletes and sportsmen and women accountable for the decisions of a political party and the Kremlin?
I think we're all accountable in many ways. I grew up in the United States. I'm accountable as a citizen for the actions of my government in invading Iraq and countless other imperialist actions. If I don't acknowledge that, I'm not actually performing my duties as a citizen. In the context of 20th century history, for instance, we have philosophers like Karl Jaspers who speak of political guilt. That is not guilt that is directly criminal guilt, participating in a criminal act, being some of the soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine. But political guilt is our guilt by association. If we don't acknowledge that, I think no matter what the society, we are failing our country and we are not acting as patriots. In the case of Ukrainian athletes and Ukrainian scholars around the world, they are entitled to their emotional reactions. Their country is being attacked for no reason other than pure naked conquest. Their peoples are being tortured and executed, raped because of who they are. And the response, as we discussed before, from Russian society has been largely muted. Those millions who left the Russian Federation after the first wave of mobilization are not storming various streets in cities in Europe, around the world, protesting Putin's regime. If anything, they seem to be disappointed that this war has gone on for so long. I think there is a lingering problem of Russian imperial chauvinism in Russian society that we all need to understand, because it explains a lot of this passive support that I mentioned of the Kremlin and of Russian politicians like Vladimir Putin. It's not simply one man ruling over a society with an iron fist. It's a society that has these dreams of imperial control around the world that is very much embedded in their own national identity. This notion of greatness, again, the allusions to American political discourse are important here, because we see the same thing and did see the same thing with the Trump phenomenon in the United States. So this is not something that's unique to Russia, although this manipulation of narratives of greatness and grievance is unique in this Russian context, and we need to understand it. So I entrust all Ukrainians to have their own emotional reaction. They are right to feel this kind of pain, and if it manifests itself in those actions, I'm not one to judge it.
We do hope that this conflict comes to a speedy end. Thank you so much for your contributions, Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, Professor Rory Finnan, for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Air India sends plane for stranded passengers in Russia. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine has not launched a planned counteroffensive to win back territory occupied by Russia yet. Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Alexei Danilov, affirmed this, adding that everyone will know about it when it happens. He dismissed statements by Russian officials who said the counteroffensive has already begun. Mr. Danilov says Russian officials had mistaken local Ukrainian advances in some frontline areas for the start of the larger operation. Russian forces who began their full-scale invasion in February 2022 are fighting Ukrainian troops along large parts of the front line. Kiev hopes the long-awaited counteroffensive will mark a pivotal moment in the war and wants to regain significant swathes of Russian-occupied territory. Danilov also says there could be no doubt that Russia caused the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam because the area has been under occupation since early in Russia's invasion. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says that talks about resolving the conflict between his country and Russia could not start with a mere cessation of hostilities. According to him, multiple negotiations and consultations at a ceasefire since Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 have only led to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. A delegation of African heads of state is expected to visit Ukraine and Russia in the next few days, hoping to persuade them to cease hostilities. A spokesperson for the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, affirmed last month no date has been set for the mission as at yet. Such a proposal means that Russian troops will remain on Ukrainian soil even as peace talks start. Ukraine previously said Russian forces should withdraw before such negotiations begin, while Moscow wants Kiev to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea as precondition for negotiations. Mr. Kuleba has been on the charm offensive in Africa to win support in the continent, where 30 of the 54 African member states of the United Nations member states voted in favor of the UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion. He had no details on what the African peace mission entailed, but appears to welcome it. Air India has sent an airplane to pick up passengers whose Delhi to San Francisco flight was diverted to Russia's Far East after their Boeing plane developed engine trouble. India's aviation minister has confirmed to reporters the 216 passengers and 16 crew on board the Tuesday flight, that is on June the 6th, had been moved to makeshift accommodations, given infrastructure limitation at the remote Magadan airport. A U.S. State Department spokesperson said it was likely there were Americans on board given the flight's destination. The diversion also raised questions over how quickly the stranded plane could be repaired amidst U.S. and European Union sanctions on exports of aviation items to Russia.
200 that is taking off at 1300 hours, so it must be in the air just now. It's 6-hour flying, 6.5-hour flying time to Magden, and it will land there, and at the earliest it will turn around not turn around, it will board all the passengers and be en route to San Francisco.
The U.S. State Department has now confirmed that less than 50 U.S. citizens were aboard the Air India flight on Tuesday from Delhi to San Francisco that was diverted to Russia's Far East after their Boeing plane developed engine trouble. Now, State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel told reporters the department is not aware of any outreach from the American citizens on board the flight to the U.S. Embassy in Russia. The flight diversion raised questions over how quickly the $200 million U.S.-built plane, whose engines are made by General Electric, could be repaired amidst U.S. and European Union sanctions on exports of aviation items to Russia. A stranded passenger named Gagan told Indian broadcaster that there were many U.S. citizens on flight who were worried given the tension between Russia and the United States.
First, we understand that there were less than 50 U.S. citizens aboard that flight. We also understand that a relief aircraft is expected to arrive later today to assist the Air India flight and the passengers continue on with their route. I will defer to Air India to speak to any other specifics about their further movements and any of the technical issues. We are not aware of any outreach from some of these American citizens to our embassy and consular officials in Russia, and so don't have anything additional to offer.
Now let's have a conversation with an expert on international relations theory at Lagos State University, Dr. Dapo Thomas, joining us from the Lagos State University here in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Olumide, for having me.
Professor, I can imagine the trepidation on the parts or in the minds of the passengers of that Delhi to San Francisco flight. Here you are being told that your plane has engine trouble. That's one, stress levels through the roof. Then the second thing, you're being told that your plane is being diverted to Russia, which essentially not a war zone, but engaged in an armed conflict. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, ordinarily, it was a very tragic incident because of the technical, the technical involvement, or maybe because of the technical dimension. And if you, why your plane had to be diverted to a war zone is definitely tragic and very, very not comfortable. Particularly when you take into consideration what happened in 2014 when the Russians bombed the Malaysian air flight. And I believe that as a result of that, the terror or the terrifying impact would have affected all the passengers and everybody. So I think it was an unfortunate incident that one should not that one should condemn or one should work against, not to happen again.
Doctor, the destruction at the Kakhovka Dam resulted in President Putin, who's been silent on many of the issues that have occurred or been reticent in recent days or in recent times, coming up quickly to speak to President Erdogan of Turkey about this issue. He's calling it sabotage on the part of the Ukrainians. What is your view? We've heard from our expert guests who've spoken to us and who've said, some of whom have said that it's obviously it's the Russians doing this.
Well, they both have history of denials. On so many occasions, the Russians have denied their involvement in so many things, in so many acts of sabotage that have happened during the war. On 2 occasions, the Ukrainians have also have their own history. The first was when they intercepted a missile fired by the Russians, and then the shrapnel or maybe the debris fell near Lviv, very close to Poland. In fact, it fell on Polish territory, and the Ukrainians started saying that it was the Russians who fired it was a missile instead of just their own interception. The interception caused the debris, so it was not directly a missile fired by Russia that missed its target. No. And then the second one was when the Ukrainians also sent drone to Kremlin, and it happened that at the end of the day, they denied initially that they had nothing or they knew nothing about it. But even their own ally, US, came up with an intel after some time to disclose that the drone was sent to Kremlin by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians went mute since then. That's for the Ukrainians. And now we have that of the Russians. One, we have so many theories to believe that it was the Russians. And the first theory is this: they were in control of the zone. Of that particular region. That part, Kherson is divided into 2 now because there is one area occupied by Ukraine. There is one occupied by Russia. So the Russia were in control of the dam until the incident. In fact, till now, they are in control of the dam. And it's possible that when you are in control of a particular region or a particular, if you are in charge of the dam, you had the time to be able to plant any kind of explosion. And there was no way the Ukrainians who are not in charge of the dam would have planted any kind of device or any kind of explosion in the dam. So they had the time, the Russians had the time to plug all sorts of explosives in the dam. That's one. Then 2, when you are attacking, when you are under attack and you are retreating, you are the one that will now destroy anything that will facilitate the movement of your attackers. So you have to slow down your attackers. And as a result of that, it's possible that the Russians destroy the dam so that they can slow down the attack because they know that the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians would come anytime so soon. And they felt that they had to at least distract them. For now, they have distracted them. I'm still wondering how the Ukrainians are saying that this will not affect them or it will not distract their counteroffensive. It's very, very unnatural. So definitely they are going to be distracted. And even if they had planned to massively attack Russia, it's going to distract them because now they have a kind of humanitarian situation or scenario to cope with. And going by what has been happening all along, you will see that Zelensky is not the kind of person that can ignore this kind of humanitarian occurrence and then continue to fight the war as if the people do not matter. Whether they are statistics or their demography, anything, these are your own people. You really have to take into consideration that these people are important to you. The Russians don't have that kind of something. Just like the first person said, they don't have history of emotions. They don't have history of sentiments when they are fighting war. Their own is to turn anywhere they are attacking. If they cannot occupy it, then they turn it to a wasteland. And that is exactly why people are saying that they suspect that the Russians were the ones responsible for the breach of the dam.
Very
you can see that they are not even making any effort to help the people, to even salvage anything. They are not even interested. Meanwhile, this is an area you have occupied. So if you really have the welfare of those people at heart, why are you not making any efforts to take them to safe land, just like the Ukrainians are doing? Everybody is volunteering to come to their aid, and they are even calling the world to come and support them, and they are doing all these things despite the fact that they are fighting the war. So when you look at it, you see that it's very possible two possibilities again. The first was for the Russians. A parliamentarian was happy that the dam was breached, that it exploded. He was happy. He was celebrating. He was seen celebrating. And then again, the Ukrainians, I saw yesterday, one of them was also explaining that the Russians were fleeing. They were speeding. They were, most of their arms and everything were swept away by the by the water and everything. And that was why people are saying, if that was the case, if you were happy that the flood helped you, or maybe, sorry, the breach of the dam helped you. So why it's possible that they would say that you are also behind this incident?
Yes,
so
Professor. Yes, we hope investigations bring a determination to the culprits in this case. But finally, on the heels of Sergei Lavrov's visit to Africa, maybe about a fortnight or less than that ago, now Kuleba is on a visit to Africa as well. This African peace mission that is being proposed, and both parties are trying to garner support for their side. For those who think that Nigeria is not directly affected by this war, or Africa shouldn't be as interested in the outcome of this conflict, what will you say to them, knowing that this is a global village and we have seen how it's affecting trade around the world?
Well, whatever you want to do now, as a region or as a continent, is not likely to affect anything, because we have parties, or we have individuals, we have countries talking to Putin. In fact, before the war actually erupted, I could count the number of times that Macron, had to do some shuttle to Russia to go and talk to Putin. I knew so many calls were made, even by Modi of India. All sorts of people made contacts and everything to prevent this outbreak of war. But unfortunately, Putin did not listen. So I do not see any individual or any individual leader in Africa who has the personality, or who have the charisma, or who have that kind of rapport or relationship with Putin to be able to to be able to ask him to withdraw all his troops. He has said it. He has said it with all sense of finality, that the annexation of Crimea, the annexation of Donetsk, the annexation of Zaporizhzhia, the annexation of Kherson, the annexation of Donetsk, the annexation of Luhansk, is final, that there is nothing, that finally they have decided to become part of Russia, and there is nothing that can be done. And that's why the Ukrainians are saying that, look, anything short of pre-2014 territorial arrangement will definitely not gel with them. And they have even proposed to him now, Zelensky was proposing to him that, look, this is the best time for him to have a diplomatic direction by withdrawing all his troops, so that there will be minimal casualties.
Certainly, Doctor. We run out of time, but we thank you for your submission. We hope that some fruit comes out of this mission, wherever these attempts are being made around the world for cessation of hostilities. We hope that they are successful in the interest of both nations. Thank you for being with us this morning.
I'm sure the US will come up with an intel very soon.
Yes, we expect that.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir. Dr. Dakwa Thomas, International Relations Theory at Lagos State University. When we return, China-Russia trade in May highest since start of Moscow's war on Ukraine. Please join us again. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now we turn our attention to how the war is affecting businesses around the globe. Laddie Williams is going to help us with that. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
China's trade with Russia in a single month has increased to its highest level since the beginning of the war.
Right.
What, pray tell, is responsible for this?
That was obviously expected. We know how, India and China, both countries, have continued to buy from Russia, especially oil. Cheap Russian oil, regardless of the sanctions. And, we talked about India,
Yes.
the other day, and how they've been buying, Russian oil at record levels. The month of May, that has shown how much, these countries are buying, from Russia at this time. And we're seeing the same thing, happen with China. It is expected because at the end of the day, these are friendly countries, still doing business, regardless of the sanctions. They're still trading, continuously. But we still have, that risk of, secondary sanctions, with the from the U.S. and the EU. They're still mulling, how to handle this situation, because even OPEC is going through the same thing, because at the end of the day, OPEC's exports to India and China, that has reduced considerably, because of how much Russia is pushing out, with oil and,
yes.
With the whole price competitiveness and all of that. So it is expected, and it's expected that it will continue to rise, going forward.
For South Africa, it seems to be a brighter story in terms of how well the currency, their rand, is doing.
Oh, yeah.
You say it's recovering
the rand,
this month of May.
The rand had a tough, very, very tough May. It fell about 7%, against the US dollar. And that was because there were allegations that, South Africa was actually selling weapons to Russia. And we know, the relationship South Africa has.
Was that the principal reason?
That was one of the major, reasons, and obviously we know how markets, react to geopolitics and all of that. So, and the power cuts in South Africa too, that was a big, contributor to the pressure, on the rand. But we're seeing, the power cuts are easing now, and, that's helping, get the rand, back in shape. The rand did gains back to about 19 rand 9 cents to the dollar, at this time. So it's a strong recovery. Hoping it continues at this time, because we know definitely it's an export dependent economy, and they need the rand, strong at this time. And we're seeing that, recovery happen right now.
So in the United States, to help Ukraine or not to help Ukraine is not the question. It's how it's going to affect their economy.
Exactly.
Raising the debt ceiling is rekindling debate in the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, remember the whole debt ceiling drama, if it was going to be raised or not, but we've definitely passed that now. And remember the fears that time was if the debt ceiling wasn't raised, it was going to be an apocalypse in the financial, markets, and definitely we've...
Armageddon.
Armageddon. So we have, surpassed that at this time. We've pushed that date, further ahead. But that has now created debate about, funding for Ukraine, this time, because, they spent a huge chunk already. The Senate has approved by $113 billion, so far. Recently, they approved $48 billion before the House got, control. That's the Republicans got control of the House. So at the end of the House Speaker McCarthy is not against, supporting Ukraine, but he's just saying, what, if we're going to support Ukraine, if we're going to send all of this money, we're not just sending money for, sending's sake. We need to know what these funds are going to be used for, and we also have to, protect the U.S. economy too, because at the end of the day, they have, spending issues right now. They need funds to.
Yeah.
This is a country that had to raise their debt ceiling. So, yeah, that's
all this as the Republican primaries are in view, and the debates and what have you.
Because
Thanks
supporting Ukraine
Ladi.
is great, but it does come at a cost.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ladi.
You're welcome.
More from Ladi Williams on Business Morning after this program, which has come to an end for today. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day, and please join us again tomorrow.